3 weeks ago in the top-floor boardroom of Sterling Capital, every executive sat frozen as the young CEO walked toward a man in a worn-out suit and placed the keys to the company in his hand. Nobody understood why a jobless stranger had been handed the power they had chased their entire careers. What they didn't know was that 3 weeks earlier, this same man had been fired with $10 left to his name. And he had spent it on a stranger who was about to change everything. The town of Fairfield, Connecticut woke slowly on weekday mornings, and Ryan Carter liked it that way. He had moved there for the quiet, for the way the light came in, flat and gray over the warehouse lot where he managed inventory, for the simple fact that nobody in Fairfield knew the name he used to carry. At 42, he was a tall man, with tired shoulders, and a face that had once looked younger than its years. Now it looked older. He preferred the company of clipboards and freight schedules to the company of people who asked questions. There had been another life before this one. In that life, Ryan Carter had been one of the most respected corporate restructuring specialists in New York, the man companies called when they were bleeding out, and no one else could stop it. He had walked into failing firms and rebuilt them from the bones up, and he had done it well enough that people spoke his name in conference rooms he was no longer in. Then his wife had died, and the language of profit and loss had stopped making sense to him, and he had walked away from all of it without looking back. He did not talk about her. He did not talk about the offices he had left behind, or the offers he still received once a year, forwarded to an email address he rarely opened. He had built a smaller world on purpose, a world the size of a warehouse floor, and he had told himself that smallness was the same thing as peace. Some mornings, he almost believed it. Most mornings, he simply went to work, kept his head down, and let the hours pass without leaving a mark on him. That was the plan anyway until the morning the plan stopped working. His supervisor called him into the back office just before noon. The company was cutting positions, the man explained, eyes fixed somewhere over Ryan's shoulder, and the warehouse was being reorganized under a new logistics contractor. It was nothing personal. It was a difficult decision made several levels above both of them. Ryan listened to the whole speech without interrupting, because he had given versions of that speech himself years ago to better people than the man delivering it now. When it was over, he thanked his supervisor, which seemed to confuse the man, and he gathered the few things he kept in his locker. A spare jacket, a travel mug, a photograph he did not look at. He drove home along the same road he always took, and the strangeness of it was that nothing about the road had changed, even though everything about his place on it had. He had $400 in his checking account and rent, due at the end of the week, and for the first time in years, the smallness of his world felt less like peace and more like a trap closing. On the way home, he stopped at a supermarket on the edge of town because there was no food in his apartment, and because stopping for groceries was the kind of ordinary thing a man did to convince himself the day was still ordinary. He took a basket instead of a cart. Bread, eggs, coffee, a few cans of soup that would stretch across the week. He moved through the aisles with the careful arithmetic of someone counting in his head, and when he reached the register, he had exactly $10 and some loose change in his wallet, the last of the cash he could spend before the rent took everything else. The woman ahead of him in line was having trouble. She was perhaps in her late 30s, dressed in a way that did not match the supermarket, a tailored coat and good shoes, the kind of clothes that belonged in a city 40 minutes south. Her cart held almost nothing: a bottle of water, a sandwich, a phone charger still in its packaging. She swiped a card, and the machine declined it. She tried it again, slower this time, and it declined again. She reached into her wallet, produced a second card, and watched that one fail too. "I'm sorry," she said to the cashier, and her voice was steady in the way that costs effort. "There must be a problem with my account. The bank flagged something this morning. I have a call into them." The cashier, a teenager, who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, shifted his weight and glanced at the growing line. "I can void it if you want," he offered, not unkindly. "You can come back." "No, the woman said. "It's fine. Just give me a moment." She tried a third card. It failed. The color was coming up in her face, now not from anger, but from the particular humiliation of being made small in front of strangers over something as ordinary as a sandwich, and she kept her chin level and her eyes forward, and Ryan watched her decide in real time not to fall apart in a grocery store. He knew that look. He had worn it himself in rooms much larger than this one, on days much worse than hers appeared to be. He understood that the amount of money was never really the point. The point was the moment when the world quietly informed you that you were no longer the kind of person it would carry. He stepped forward before he had finished deciding to. "I've got it," Ryan said. The woman turned. "Excuse me." Whatever she has, he told the cashier, and he set his own basket down on the floor beside the register, the bread and the eggs and the cans of soup, the food he had counted out so carefully. He took the $10 bill from his wallet and laid it on the counter and the few coins after it, and it covered her water and her sandwich and her phone charger with almost nothing left over. "You don't have to do that," the woman said quickly. "Really, I can come back. It's already done," Ryan said. He was not gentle about it, and he was not warm about it. He simply said it the way a person states a fact, and he picked his own basket back up off the floor, the food he could no longer afford to buy, and he set it on the end of the counter for the cashier to put away. "At least let me." She was reaching into her coat now for a business card, for a name, for some way to fix the imbalance of it. "Let me get your information. I'll pay you back the moment my account clears. What's your name?" But Ryan was already turning toward the door. He had not done it to be thanked, and being thanked would have required him to explain himself, and explaining himself was the one thing he had moved to Fairfield to avoid. He raised one hand, without looking back, a small gesture that meant it was nothing, and he walked out of the supermarket into the gray afternoon, with no groceries, and no money, and no idea that he had just changed the direction of his own life. The woman stood at the register holding her sandwich, watching the glass door swing shut behind him. Her name was Claire Sullivan, and she was the chief executive officer of Sterling Capital, a private investment firm that managed more money than the entire town of Fairfield would see in a generation. Her cards had failed because her bank had frozen her personal accounts that morning as a precaution after fraud monitors flagged unusual activity on the firm-linked banking she used. It was already being handled by people whose salaries she signed. She had stopped at the supermarket on her way back from a property the firm was evaluating because she had been hungry and had not wanted to wait. She could have bought the building they were standing in, and a stranger with $10 to his name had just paid for her lunch and walked away as if it cost him nothing when she had seen the basket he left behind and understood exactly what it had cost him. She did not like owing people. More than that, she did not like not understanding things, and she did not understand him at all. She found the cashier's eyes. "The man who just left. Do you know him?" The teenager shrugged. "He comes in sometimes. Works at the warehouse off Route 1, I think. Or used to. I heard they cut a bunch of people this week." Claire thanked him, took the sandwich she no longer wanted, and walked out to a car that cost more than the cashier would earn in 5 years. She sat in the back seat for a long moment, without telling the driver to go anywhere. Then she opened her phone and made a note of 2 things: the warehouse off Route 1, and a face she could not place, but somehow felt she should have. It took her people 2 days to find him. It would have taken less, but Ryan Carter had spent years making himself difficult to find, and the trail of him went cold quickly. There was no professional profile, no recent record, almost nothing for the last several years, except a lease in Fairfield and a warehouse job that had ended that same week. But when Claire's head of research finally assembled the older pieces, the pieces from before the silence, she sat in her office reading them twice to be sure she had it right. The man who had paid for her sandwich was Ryan Carter. The Ryan Carter. the name that older partners at Sterling still used as a verb when they talked about saving a dying company. She had heard the name herself years ago before she ran the firm back when she was learning the business, and people spoke of him the way they spoke of a storm that had passed before you arrived. He had been the best in the city, at the one thing her company now desperately needed, and then he had simply disappeared. And no one she asked seemed to know why. She did not send an assistant. She drove to Fairfield herself. Ryan was on the steps outside his apartment building when the car pulled up, a coffee going cold in his hand, and the morning ahead of him unstructured for the first time in years. He recognized her before she finished crossing the lot, and something in his chest tightened because he had assumed the supermarket was a closed door, and now here it was, standing open in a tailored coat. "Mr. Carter," Claire said, "I owe you $10. You don't owe me anything." He stood up out of habit the way he had once stood when clients entered a room. "It was groceries. Forget it." "I can't forget it." She stopped a few feet from him and looked at him directly the way people looked at him when they wanted something. "I tried. It bothered me for 2 days. So I had someone look into you, which I understand is a strange thing to admit. And what they found bothered me more than the $10 did. You're Ryan Carter. You used to take companies that were already dead and bring them back. And then you stopped. That was a long time ago, 11 years. I checked." Claire glanced at the building behind him, at the cracked steps, and the small life he had built on top of the larger one he had buried. "I'm not here to dig into why you left. That's yours. I'm here because I run a company that is in more trouble than the people who work for me. Realize, and a few days ago, a man with nothing in his wallet paid for my lunch and walked off before I could thank him. I've spent my whole career around people who take. I don't meet many who give. It made me want to understand who you are, and what I found is that you might be exactly the person I need." Ryan looked at her for a long moment, and the warehouse lot was very quiet, and somewhere behind his eyes, a door he had nailed shut a long time ago shifted on its hinges. "I don't do that work anymore," he said. "I'm not the person those files say I am. That man's gone." "I don't think people go anywhere," Claire said. "I think they hide. You've gotten good at it." She reached into her coat, and this time, she did produce a card, and she held it out to him without pressing it on him. "Sterling Capital. I'm the chief executive. I have a situation that needs the kind of mind you used to have, and I think you still have it, and I'm not interested in your resume from a decade ago. I'm interested in the man who left his own groceries on a counter for a stranger. That's a rarer thing in my world than competence." He did not take the card right away. He stood there holding his cold coffee, a man who had spent 11 years convincing himself that the smallest possible life was the safest one, and he understood that whatever she was offering was not really a job. It was a door back into the world he had walked out of, the world that had cost him so much, the world he had decided he was finished with on the worst day of his life. "What kind of situation?" he asked, and he heard himself ask it, and he knew that asking was already a kind of answer. 3 weeks, Claire said. "That's all I'm asking for. From the day you start, I have 21 days before some decisions get made that can't be unmade. There's a board meeting at the end of it, where the future of the firm gets decided, and I need someone who can look at what's actually wrong and tell me the truth, because the people around me have stopped doing that. 3 weeks of your time. After that, you can come back here and disappear again, and I'll never bother you. But I think you should hear what's broken before you say no." Ryan looked down at the card. Sterling Capital. A logo he half recognized. A name on a building 40 minutes south in a city he had promised himself he would never drive back into. "Why me?" he said. "You could hire anyone. You could buy a whole firm of people who do this." "I've tried hiring people who do this," Claire answered. "They tell me what I want to hear and bill me for it. You left a job and a fortune behind because something mattered to you more than the money did, and I still don't know what it was. But I'd rather have one man who walks away from things he doesn't believe in than 100 who only know how to stay." She finally extended the card the last few inches until it touched his fingers. "Take a day, then call me. Or don't. I'll respect either one." She turned and walked back to her car, and she did not look over her shoulder to see whether he was watching, because she had learned long ago that the people worth waiting for were the ones you did not chase. Ryan stood on the cracked steps of his building for a long time after the car had gone. The coffee in his hand had gone fully cold. In his other hand, he held a small white card with a name on it that belonged to a world he had spent 11 years pretending he had escaped, and he understood with the clear and unwelcome honesty he had once been famous for, that the escape had only ever been a kind of hiding. He could stay. He could throw the card away, find another warehouse, keep the world the size of a single floor, and let the man in those files stay buried where he had put him. Or he could drive south into the city he had fled and find out whether there was anything left of who he used to be. He went inside without deciding, but he did not throw the card away. For one full day, the card sat on Ryan's kitchen counter, propped against the salt shaker, where he could not avoid it. He told himself he was not going to call. He told himself it, while he reread the lease he could no longer pay, and while he scanned listings for warehouse work that paid in cash, and while he sat in the dark with the television off, doing the kind of arithmetic that always came out the same way. The next morning he called Claire Sullivan and told her no. "I understand," she said, and she did not argue, which was worse than if she had. "Can I ask why?" "Because the man you read about in those files made a lot of money fixing things, and then the one thing that mattered broke, and he couldn't fix it." His voice was flat-controlled, the voice he used for facts he had stopped feeling. "I'm not interested in being good at something that didn't matter when it counted. I appreciate the offer. I do. But that part of my life is closed." Claire did not fill the silence with reassurance. "Then I won't push you," she said. "But I'd like to show you something before you go back to the warehouse. Not a pitch, just an hour. Come see what's actually wrong, and if you still want to walk away, I'll drive you home myself. 1 hour, Mr. Carter. I think you owe yourself that much, even if you don't owe me anything." He should have said no again. Instead, he found himself agreeing, because something in the way she refused to chase him made the door harder to close than slamming it would have been. The drive south undid 11 years and 40 minutes. The skyline came up out of the haze the way it always had, and his hands tightened on the wheel as the city took him back in street by street until he was standing in the marble lobby of a building he had no memory of and every reason to fear. Claire met him at the elevators herself. She did not shake his hand like a client. She simply nodded, the way you nod at someone who has come a long way against his own better judgment. And she took him upstairs. What she showed him was not a pitch, it was a wound. Sterling Capital, she explained as they walked the executive floor, had spent 40 years building a reputation for trust. It managed the money of people who could have taken their money anywhere, and they stayed because the firm had always done what it said it would do. But trust was a quiet thing, easy to spend and hard to count, and somewhere in the last several years, the firm had begun spending it faster than it earned it. Deals had been pushed through that served the partners more than the clients. Numbers had been arranged to look better than they were. The fraud flags that had frozen her accounts in that supermarket were only the surface of it, the part that had finally become visible. "On paper, we're healthy," Claire said, as she set a stack of reports in front of him in a glass-walled conference room. "On paper, we're one of the strongest firms of our size in the region. But paper lies, and you used to be the only person I ever heard of who could read what was underneath it. I don't need someone to make the numbers prettier. I have people for that. I need someone to tell me how much of this firm is real." Ryan looked at the reports for a long moment without opening them. Then he sat down, and he opened the first one, and the part of his mind he had kept boarded up for 11 years came online the way a city comes back after a blackout, one block of lights at a time. It took him less than an hour to see it. He read the way he used to read, fast and merciless, skipping the language and going straight to the structure underneath, and the structure underneath was rotten in a way that made his stomach turn. The firm was not dying of bad luck. It was dying of bad faith. Somewhere near the top, decisions were being made to protect a handful of people at the expense of everyone who trusted them, and the architecture of the company had been quietly redrawn to hide it. "You have a governance problem," he said, finally closing the report. "Not a market problem. The market didn't do this. Your own people did. Someone restructured the reporting lines so that the board only sees what a few executives want them to see. The breach isn't your crisis. The breach just turned on the lights." He looked up at her. "Who benefits from the board staying blind?" Claire's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "That's the question I've been afraid to ask out loud." "Then ask it." "I think I know the answer," she said. "And I think if I move against him without proof, I lose the board, and I lose the firm." She sat down across from him, and for the first time since the supermarket, she looked less like a chief executive and more like a person carrying something alone. "3 weeks, Mr. Carter. I'm not asking you to come back to the industry. I'm asking you to help me tell the truth about one company before it's too late to matter. After that, you can disappear again with my blessing. But you've already seen it now. You can't tell me you don't." He could not tell her he did not. That was the trouble. He had walked in determined to feel nothing, and instead he had felt the old engine turn over the clean, cold pleasure of seeing a problem whole. It frightened him more than the city had. "Temporary," he said. 3 weeks. I look at it, I tell you the truth, and then I'm done. I'm not joining anything. I'm not standing in front of your board as Ryan Carter the legend. I'm a consultant you hired for 21 days, and when it's over, I go home." "Agreed," Claire said, and she offered her hand, and this time he took it. The work consumed him faster than he expected. He came in early and stayed late, and the firm gave him a small office at the end of a hall, and within the first week, he had mapped the whole sickness of the place. The deeper he went, the clearer it became that the rot had a name attached to it, and the name was Victor Mercer. Mercer had sat on the board of Sterling Capital for 9 years, and he was the kind of man who had learned to mistake patience for principle. He was older than Ryan Silver, and smooth, the sort of executive who never raised his voice because he had never needed to. He controlled the board's most important committees, and over the years he had reshaped the firm's reporting structure so quietly that no single change had looked like a power grab, though all of them together had been exactly that. The clients whose trust the firm was spending were in many cases being steered toward deals that enriched a small circle Mercer sat at the center of. What Ryan also understood as the days went by was why Claire could not simply expose him. Mercer was liked. He had spent a decade being unfailingly reasonable in rooms where reason was rare, and he had done favors that men remembered, and half the board owed him something. To accuse him without airtight proof would look like a young chief executive panicking and attacking the firm's most respected elder. The board would close ranks around the familiar man, not the new truth. Ryan was in the middle of building that proof when he discovered something that had nothing to do with the numbers. He discovered that he was healing. It crept up on him without permission. He noticed it one evening when he realized he had worked 9 straight hours without once thinking about the warehouse or the small, safe life in Fairfield, or the photograph he never looked at. He noticed it in the way the people on the floor had started coming to his office, not because they had to, but because he listened, and because he asked about the human beings behind the numbers in a way the firm had forgotten how to do. He noticed it in himself, a man who had spent 11 years convinced that the part of him capable of this was dead, finding that it had only been sleeping. He had told Claire that the man in the files was gone. He was beginning to suspect that he had been wrong, that the man had never gone anywhere, that grief had simply convinced him to bury someone who was still breathing. Claire saw it before he admitted it. She had watched a great many people move through her firm, and most of them wanted something obvious, money or title, or the feeling of standing close to power. Ryan wanted none of it. What she saw in him as the second week turned was a man who cared more about the people in the building than about being right in front of them. A man who treated a junior analyst's question with the same seriousness as a partner's. A man for whom the work was never about the work. It was a quality she had stopped believing existed in her world. "You don't want any of this," she said to him one night when the floor had emptied, and they were the last two in the conference room. "The recognition, the position, any of it. I keep waiting for you to tell me what you really want out of these 3 weeks, and you never do." "I want the truth to come out before it hurts people who trusted you," Ryan said. "That's all. After that, I don't have a use for any of it." He looked at her across the table, at a woman who had chased him down over $10 because she could not stand to leave a kindness unexplained. "You've spent so long around people who only take that you've stopped believing there's another kind. I'm just reminding you." "And what reminded you?" she asked. He did not answer that one. But he did not change the subject either, and she let it go because she was learning how he worked, and she understood that some doors opened only when you stopped pulling on them. The trouble arrived in the 3rd week, the way trouble always arrives, dressed as procedure. Victor Mercer had noticed him. It would have been impossible not to. A stranger had appeared in the building, asking precise questions in precise places, and a man like Mercer did not survive 9 years on a board by failing to notice when someone began turning over the right stones. He did not confront Ryan directly. Men like Mercer never did. Instead, he raised the matter at a committee meeting with the gentle concern of a man protecting the firm from itself. "I'm told we've brought in an outside consultant," Mercer said, his tone all reasonableness the room arranged to listen to him. "Mr. Carter, I'm sure his intentions are good. But I have to ask whether it's wise in a moment as delicate as this one to hand the firm's most sensitive material to a man who hasn't worked in this industry in over a decade. I knew his reputation years ago. It was considerable. But reputations age, and so do the people who hold them. We have a fiduciary duty here. I'd feel more comfortable if his access were reviewed." It was masterful, and Ryan recognized it for what it was the moment Claire told him. Mercer had not attacked him. He had wrapped a knife in concern for the clients, and he had made Ryan's outsider status into a liability instead of an asset. Within 2 days, Ryan found doors closing that had been open. Files he had been promised were suddenly under review. Members of the board he had not yet met now looked at him when they passed him in the hall as a problem rather than a help. He felt the old wound open. The doubt he had carried for 11 years, the suspicion that he no longer belonged in any room that mattered, came back with the familiarity of an old injury in cold weather. He had been here before on the wrong side of a room full of people who had already decided about him, and the last time he had been here, the thing he was fighting for had died anyway. "They're going to push you out," he told Claire. They were in her office late again, the city lit up beyond the glass. "Mercer's not going to fight you on the facts. He's smarter than that. He's going to make me the issue instead of the firm, and he's going to win because he's been here 9 years, and I've been here 3 weeks. He set down the half-finished analysis he had been building. "I've seen this exact thing before. A man who's right gets buried by a room that finds it more comfortable to keep believing the man who's wrong. I don't have it in me to lose that fight twice." "You're not the man you were 11 years ago," Claire said. "You keep telling me you are. You're not. The man in those files won every fight, but the last one, and it broke him. You're someone else now. You've spent 3 weeks caring about people you'll never see again, and that's not weakness. That's the only thing that's going to beat Victor Mercer." "Caring doesn't win board votes," Ryan said. "Proof wins board votes, and he's cutting off my access to the proof. Then we find another way to the proof." But even as she said it, the strain showed at the edges of her, the chief executive who had built her authority on never appearing to need anyone, now needing him visibly, and hating that she did. "I can't do this without you. I've spent 2 years pretending I could and I can't. If you walk out now, Mercer keeps the firm blind, and everyone who trusted us pays for it." Ryan looked out at the city. The same city that had taken so much from him lit up and indifferent below them. By the end of that week, it had gotten worse. Mercer made his move at a board session Ryan was not permitted to attend. He proposed with great regret that the firm's restructuring review be tabled until a more appropriate time, that the consultant's engagement be allowed to expire at the end of its 3 weeks, and that the board return to the steady hands that had guided it for years. He did not need to win every vote. He only needed to run out the clock. Ryan's 21 days were almost gone, and when they were gone, the analysis would die unfinished, and the truth he had nearly assembled would be filed away as the work of an outsider who had overstepped. That night, Ryan sat alone in the small office at the end of the hall, the analysis spread out in front of him, weeks of work that the board was preparing to bury without reading. Everything he had rebuilt in himself over 3 weeks pressed up against the old certainty that he was not enough, that he never had been, that the one time it had truly counted, he had failed, and a person he loved had died anyway. And no amount of being right in a conference room had been able to change it. He thought about the warehouse, the small life, the world the size of a single floor where nothing was at stake because nothing was real. It was still there 40 minutes north, waiting to take him back. All he had to do was finish out the 3 weeks hand, clear a report that no one would read, and disappear the way he had promised her he could. He began slowly to gather the pages into a single stack, the way a man closes a book he has decided not to finish. He would write the final report. He would tell the truth in it completely, and without flinching, and he would leave it on her desk, and then he would go home because the room had already decided, and he did not believe he had it in him to change a room's mind one more time. He turned off the light in the small office. He did not yet know that telling the whole truth plainly to a room that did not want to hear it was the one thing Victor Mercer had never planned for. He wrote through the night. Not the report he had promised Claire, the safe one, the truthful one that no one would read. He wrote the other thing, the one he had not let himself write in 11 years. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, he understood why turning off that office light had felt like a lie. He was not the man who had lost the last fight. He was a man who had spent 3 weeks remembering that the fight had never been about being right. It had been about the people on the other side of the numbers. By dawn, he had stopped gathering the pages to close the book. He had started arranging them to open it. He called Claire before her car had even left her building. "Don't let the board table it," he said. "Whatever Mercer's proposed, find a way to keep the meeting on the calendar. I'll be there. Not as a consultant whose time is running out, as someone who has something to say, and I only need them to let me say it once." "They've already moved to close your access," Claire said. "Mercer's lined up the votes to let your engagement expire. If you stand up in that room, he'll cut you off before you finish a sentence." "Are you certain?" "No," Ryan said. "But I'd rather be uncertain in the room than certain in the parking lot. Get me 10 minutes. That's all I've ever needed." The meeting was held in the largest conference room on the top floor, the one with the long table, and the city laid out behind the glass like a thing the firm believed it owned. The full board was there. Howard Banks, the chairman, an old man, who had founded the firm on the trust it was now spending, sat at the head, tired and watchful. Victor Mercer sat to his right, Silver, and composed a man who had already counted the votes and found them comfortable. And at the far end, where outsiders were seated to remind them they were outsiders, Ryan Carter sat in the same worn suit he had worn the day he paid for a stranger's lunch, holding a single folder. Mercer opened, as Ryan knew he would with reason. He thanked the consultant for his service. He observed with the warmth of a man burying something gently that the engagement had reached its natural end. He suggested the board return its sensitive work to the seasoned hands that had carried it for years, and he framed the whole thing as prudence, as the firm protecting itself from the well-meaning enthusiasm of an outsider who could not be expected to understand its history. It was when Mercer finished satisfied that Howard Banks turned his tired eyes toward the far end of the table and asked whether Mr. Carter had anything he wished to add before the board voted. Ryan stood. He did not open the folder. "I was hired to find out how much of this firm is real," he said. "I'm going to tell you, and then you can vote me out, and it won't change what's true." He let his eyes travel down the table, meeting each face without hurry. 40 years ago, this firm was built on one promise, that when people gave you their money, you would treat it the way you'd want yours treated. People stayed with Sterling Capital for 40 years, not because you were the smartest firm in the room. There are smarter firms. They stayed because they trusted you. And somewhere in the last several years, a few people in this building started spending that trust like it was theirs to spend. A stir went around the table. Mercer's expression did not change, but his hand settled flat on the wood. "I'm not going to drown you in numbers," Ryan went on. "You have people who do that, and the numbers have been arranged, so you'll see what you're meant to see. That's the whole problem. Somebody redrew the reporting lines in this firm so that this board, the people legally responsible for it, only learns what a small circle decides to let you learn. You weren't blind by accident. You were blinded on purpose, and the breach that froze your systems didn't cause this crisis. It just turned the lights on while the room was still arranged the way someone left it. This is precisely the kind of insinuation I warned about," Mercer said, smoothly turning to Banks. "An outsider, 3 weeks in, accusing this board of—" "I haven't accused anyone of anything," Ryan said, and he did not raise his voice because he had learned a long time ago that the quiet voice was the one O'Room leaned in to hear. "I'm describing a structure. Anyone who wants to know who built that structure can read the record of who proposed each change to the reporting lines over the last 9 years. It's all in the minutes. I didn't invent it. I just put the pages next to each other." He finally set the folder down on the table unopened and left his hand on it. "It's in here with dates and signatures if this board wants it. But I'd rather you understood the thing itself before you argue about the man who found it." The room had gone very still. Howard Banks looked at the folder and then at Mercer, and something passed across the old chairman's face that had not been there a minute before, the look of a man who had spent years choosing not to ask a question and now found it asked for him. "What I came here to say isn't really about Victor Mercer," Ryan said, and the use of the name landed harder for how plainly he said it. "Whether you keep him or not is your business. I'm leaving tonight either way. What I want to tell you is what I learned in 3 weeks inside a company I had no intention of caring about. I used to do this for a living. I was good at it, and I walked away because I decided that being right in rooms like this one didn't matter. I was wrong about that. It matters. It matters to every person who works on the floors beneath us, who trusted that the people up here were telling them the truth. A company isn't its numbers. It's the promise underneath the numbers, and you can rebuild numbers, but once you spend the promise, you don't get it back." He looked down the table at Claire, who had not said a word, who had brought him into this room, and then trusted him to stand alone in it. "You can build a firm 2 ways, Ryan said. "You can build it to protect the people at the top, which is what's been quietly happening here for years, and it works right up until the day it doesn't, and then it goes all at once. Or you can build it on responsibility, on the boring, unglamorous idea that the people who trust you should be able to see exactly what you're doing with what they gave you. That's not charity. It's the only thing that lasts. I'm not asking you to believe it because it's noble. I'm telling you, it's the only version of this firm that's still standing in 10 years. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Howard Banks reached out and slid the unopened folder across the table toward himself, and the gesture said more than any vote could have. "I think," the old chairman said slowly, "the board would like to read this before we decide anything. All of it." He looked at Mercer then, and his voice did not rise either, but there was iron under it that had not shone in years. "Victor, I've known you 9 years. I'd like very much for there to be an innocent explanation in these pages. For the firm's sake, I hope there is. But we're going to read them. Mercer understood in that moment that the thing he had never planned for had happened. He had prepared for an attack, and he had prepared to defend himself against one, and he had counted the votes for a fight. What he had not prepared for was a man who refused to fight him at all, who simply set the truth on the table and let the room look at it. There was nothing to push against. The reasonableness he had spent a decade perfecting had no use against a man who was not asking the board to be angry, only to see. The vote Mercer had counted on never happened. What happened instead was that the board, for the first time in years, asked to see everything, and over the days that followed, they saw it, and the structure Ryan had described held up under every page. The minutes told the story exactly as he had said they would, dates and signatures, a slow 9-year redrawing of who was allowed to know what. By the end of the week, Victor Mercer was no longer on the board of Sterling Capital, and the men who had owed him favors discovered, as such men always do, that loyalty to a sinking name was not worth the cost of going down with it. Claire did not gloat. She had learned that from watching Ryan, who took no visible satisfaction in any of it. She convened the board one final time before the matter was closed, and she stood at the head of the long table where banks usually sat, and she told them plainly what she had not been able to tell them before. 3 weeks ago my accounts were frozen. The morning we now know traces back to the heart of all this, she said. A man I had never met paid for my groceries with the last of his own money and walked out before I could thank him. I had him looked into because I couldn't understand why a stranger with nothing would do that. What I found was the best restructuring mind this industry ever produced, working in a warehouse, hiding from a world that had hurt him. She looked toward Ryan. He didn't save this firm because he wanted anything from it. That's exactly why he could see what the rest of us couldn't. The men who had spent 3 weeks treating Ryan as a problem to be managed now looked at him the way the room had once looked at Victor Mercer, with the respect a room reserves for the person who turned out to be right. He did not enjoy it any more than he had enjoyed their suspicion. He had never done the work for the way the room looked at him. That in the end was the whole of his advantage. 3 weeks to the day after he had first walked onto the executive floor of Sterling Capital, Ryan Carter was asked to come to the largest conference room on the top floor one last time. He came expecting to say goodbye. The 3 weeks were over. He had told the truth the firm had survived, and the deal had always been that when it was done, he could go home and disappear the way she had promised to let him. He had even told himself on the drive in that he was ready to go, though somewhere along the way the words had stopped feeling true. The full board was waiting. Howard Banks stood, which the old man rarely did, and Claire crossed the room toward Ryan with something small in her hand, and the executives who lined the table watched in a silence that no one moved to break. 3 weeks ago you handed a stranger the last money you had, Claire said. I never did pay you back the $10. I'm not going to. It would insult what it was. She held out her hand, and resting in her open palm was a set of keys. These open the executive offices on this floor. The board has voted to ask you to stay as co-chief of strategy with a mandate to rebuild this firm on exactly the thing you described in that room. Not to protect the people at the top, to keep the promise underneath the numbers. We're not offering it to the man in the old files. We're offering it to the man who left his own groceries on a counter. The room stayed quiet. Ryan looked at the keys in her palm, and then at the city beyond the glass, the city that had taken his wife and his old life, and 11 years, the city he had sworn he would never drive back into. He understood standing there that the keys were not the thing he had come back for. He had told Claire on the first day that the man in those files was gone, and he had been wrong, and the work of 3 weeks had not been about proving the old man was still alive. It had been about discovering that the better man, the one who could sit in a warehouse and still give away his last $10 to a stranger, had been there underneath the whole time, waiting for a reason to stand up. I told you that part of my life was closed, Ryan said. I think I needed it to be closed for a long time, I'm not sure it ever really was. He reached out and took the keys from her open hand and closed his fingers around them, and the weight of them was smaller than he had expected and heavier than he could say. I'll stay. Not for the office, for the promise. As long as this firm keeps it, so will I. What he carried out of that room was not the title, and it was not the keys, and it was not the respect of men who had doubted him. It was something he had given up for dead on the worst day of his life, and found again in the most ordinary place imaginable at a supermarket register with $10 and a choice. It was the belief that a life can begin again, that the man you used to be is not lost, only waiting, that the smallest act of kindness offered at the moment you have the least to give does not vanish. It travels somewhere you cannot follow, and sometimes, weeks later, it comes back through a door you thought you had closed forever, and it hands you the keys.